Winter, 1944. A stretch of front somewhere in eastern France. A German battalion commander, studying the American positions opposite him through a periscope, doing what commanders do, which is trying to understand the enemy. If you were that German officer, you had been in this war for a very long time. Some of your men had been fighting continuously since 1941, not with breaks, not with leave that came reliably, continuously, moved from one crisis to the next, one front to the next, held in the line for months, pulled out only when the unit had been so thoroughly destroyed that it had to be rebuilt from replacements. That was normal. That was how it worked. That was what being a soldier meant. And then you began to notice something about the Americans opposite you that made no sense at all. They kept leaving, not retreating, not being destroyed, simply leaving. A unit would be in the line opposite you, and then it would be gone, and a different American unit would be there instead, and the first one had not been beaten. It had been relieved, taken out, sent somewhere behind the lines to rest. And it got stranger, because your intelligence told you the Americans behind the front had places set up for this. Rest centers, facilities where men were sent, in rotation, for a few days, to be clean and warm and fed, and to sleep in something that was not a hole in the ground. There were clubs, there were showers, there were unbelievably entertainers who came to perform for them, and individual men rotated too. A man would be pulled out of the line for a few days, not because he was wounded, not because he had failed in any way, but because he had simply been at the front for too long, and somebody had decided he needed to stop for a while. To a German officer in 1944, this was almost incomprehensible, and the conclusion he reached was the conclusion his entire military culture handed to him ready-made. They are soft. They cannot take it. A real army does not need rest centers and shower units and entertainers. A real soldier endures. We have men who have been in the line for a year, for 2 years, and they do not go to clubs, and they do not see entertainers, and they hold. That is what a soldier is. He was wrong. And what he was looking at was not softness. It was something far more dangerous to him, and it rested on a piece of knowledge that the American army had gone out and acquired, deliberately, scientifically, at enormous cost, and that the German army had, for reasons buried deep in its own culture, refused to accept. Here is the finding, and it is one of the most important discoveries about human beings made in the 20th century, and it came out of that war. American Army researchers, studying infantrymen in sustained combat, arrived at a conclusion that was, at the time, close to heretical. They found that psychiatric breakdown under prolonged combat was not primarily a matter of weak character, or poor discipline, or defective men. It was a matter of time. They found that after a certain accumulated period of continuous combat exposure, the figures discussed ran to something in the region of 200 to 240 days. The average, normal, healthy infantryman would become a psychiatric casualty. Not the weak ones, not the cowards, the average man, and the strong ones too, eventually, because the clock was running for everybody. The conclusion was stated in a form that has echoed through military medicine ever since. There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Every man has a breaking point, and the only variables are how fast he gets there and whether anyone takes him out before he arrives. Now think about what that finding does to an army that accepts it. If breakdown is a function of exposure time, then it is not a moral failing. It is not cowardice. It is not something to be punished or shamed out of a man. It is a supply problem. It is exactly like fuel, or ammunition, or dry socks. Endurance is a consumable. It is drawn down by every day in the line, and when it is gone, and no amount of exhortation will conjure more of it. And the correct response to a consumable running out is not to shout at the man who is running out of it. It is to build a system that resupplies him. This is not a story about rest camps. This is a forensic audit of what happens when one army treats the human mind as a finite resource to be measured, managed, and replenished, and the other treats it as a test of character that a proper man simply passes. Only one of those two positions is true, and the war proved which. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to start, as always, by understanding the German position from the inside. because the German army was not run by fools and its attitude was not simple cruelty. The German military tradition held that the soldier's endurance was, essentially, unlimited if his character was correct. Fighting spirit came from discipline, from comradeship, from duty, from the bonds between men in a small unit. And those bonds were real, and they were the single strongest thing in the German army. The cohesion of a German infantry squad, the willingness of men to keep fighting for each other long after any rational hope was gone, is one of the genuine phenomena of the Second World War, and Allied officers who fought them remarked on it constantly. So the Germans were not wrong that comradeship sustains men. They were right about that. Every serious study of combat motivation agrees that men fight, above all, for the men beside them. Where they went wrong was in what they concluded from it. They concluded that if a man broke down, the problem was in the man. His character was insufficient. His will was weak. His attachment to duty and comrades was defective. Psychiatric breakdown, Kriegsneurose, war neurosis, was treated, in the German system, with deep suspicion. There was a strong institutional belief that it was frequently a form of malingering, a way of escaping duty, a weakness that must not be indulged because indulging it would spread. And that belief had a hard edge. The German army's approach to men who could not continue was, in many cases, punitive rather than medical. Discipline in the German armed forces was severe, and became more severe as the war went on. And the number of German soldiers executed by their own military justice system for offenses connected to failure of duty runs into the many thousands, a figure vastly higher than anything comparable in the American or British armies. Understand what that does inside a man. If your army has decided that breakdown is cowardice, and that cowardice is a capital matter, then a man who feels himself starting to come apart has nowhere to go. He cannot report it. He cannot ask for help. He must simply hold, and go on holding, because the alternative is not a hospital bed. It is a disciplinary proceeding, or worse. So the German soldier held, and he held magnificently, and for a very long time, and that endurance is genuinely one of the astonishing things about the German army. And underneath, the resource was draining, and nobody was measuring it, and nobody was allowed to say so. Now add the arithmetic, because even if the Germans had wanted to rotate their men, by 1944 they could not. Rotation requires spare formations. To pull a division out of the line and rest it, you need another division to put in its place. That is the whole trick, and it is not a psychological insight. It is a manpower calculation. An army that has more divisions than it has frontage can rotate. An army that has less frontage covered than it needs cannot. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly greater manpower, had no spare formations. There was nobody to put in. So German divisions stayed and stayed and stayed, held in the line until they were ground down to a fraction of their strength, then patched up with replacements while still in position, or pulled out only to be thrown into a worse crisis somewhere else. And leave, the individual soldiers' leave home, became increasingly a thing that was promised and canceled. As the fronts collapsed and the crises multiplied, leave was suspended, delayed, revoked. The man who had been counting on 3 weeks at home found himself still in the line, and then found the leave canceled entirely, and then found himself moved to another emergency. So the German soldier faced a war with no visible end and no scheduled relief. There was no number to count down to. There was no rotation. There was no rest center. There was only the line, and the next crisis, and the belief, enforced by a disciplinary system with teeth, that a proper soldier does not run out. That is the German calculus, a culture that located endurance in character rather than in physiology. A disciplinary system that treated breakdown as a failure to be punished rather than a condition to be treated. And, underneath both, a manpower shortage so severe that even if the doctrine had been different, there was simply nobody to send in so that a man could go and sleep. Now let us look at what the Americans found out, and what they did with it. Part 2. The American answer. The American army did not begin the war enlightened about this. That has to be said clearly, because the story is not that the Americans were wise from the start. They were not. Early in the war, American practice was closer to the traditional view, a suspicion of psychiatric casualties, a fear of malingering, an instinct to treat breakdown as a discipline problem. And there was a famous incident in Sicily in 1943 in which one of the most celebrated American generals of the war struck two hospitalized soldiers who were suffering from combat stress, accusing them of cowardice. An incident that caused an enormous public scandal, nearly ended his career, and required the personal intervention of the Supreme Commander. That scandal matters, and not for the reasons people usually tell it. It matters because of what happened next. The American system's reaction was not to defend the general's view, it was to repudiate it. The institution, publicly and at the highest level, came down on the side of the men in the hospital tent, and the incident became a marker in the American Army's shift toward treating combat stress as a medical reality rather than a moral failing. That is the difference in a single episode. Both armies contained men who believed breakdown was cowardice. Only one of them had a system that overruled those men. And what the American system did instead was go and study the problem with the same cold statistical seriousness it applied to burning tanks and trench foot and the ballistics of a shell. Army researchers went into combat units and measured. They looked at when men broke, and under what conditions, and how long they lasted, and they came back with the finding we started with, that psychiatric casualty rates were driven overwhelmingly by exposure time, that the average infantryman had a finite number of days in him, and that beyond that horizon breakdown was not the exception, but the expectation. They also found something that surprised people. Psychiatric casualties were not concentrated among the weak or the unfit. They occurred across the whole population of combat soldiers. Good soldiers broke, brave soldiers broke, decorated soldiers broke. The variable was not character, it was time under fire. That single finding turned an accusation into a logistics problem, and the American Army, presented with a logistics problem, knew exactly what to do. First, treatment, delivered forward and fast. The Americans developed an approach to combat stress that rested on three principles, and they are still taught today. Proximity, treat the man close to his unit, not far in the rear. Immediacy, treat him at once, not after days of evacuation. Expectancy, treat him with the explicit, stated assumption that he is a normal man, having a normal reaction, and that he will recover and return to his unit. The logic is precise. If you evacuate a man far to the rear and label him a psychiatric patient, you tell him he is broken and different, and he begins to become that. If you keep him near his unit, let him sleep, feed him, treat him warmly and briefly, and tell him plainly that this happens to everyone, and he will be back with his friends in a few days, then a large proportion of men actually did recover and go back. And they did. A substantial share of American combat stress casualties treated under this system returned to duty. The forward treatment worked, and it worked because it was built on a correct understanding of what was actually happening to the man. Second, rotation and rest, built into the structure. The American Army pulled units out of the line to rest and refit, not as a mercy but as maintenance. Divisions came out, were rested, absorbed replacements, retrained, and went back in. Rest centers were established behind the front, where men could get a shower, clean clothes, hot food, a bed, and a few days of not being shot at. Entertainment was organized and taken forward, and the fact that a national entertainment organization was sending performers to combat theaters was not frivolity. It was the same institutional decision that produced the ice cream in the mail. Morale is a supply item. Ship it. Third, and this is the one that sounds smallest and mattered enormously, the Americans gave their men numbers to count. We saw it with the bomber crews and their mission tally. On the ground, later in the war, the Army introduced a point system for demobilization, credits for time served, for combat, for decorations, for children at home, and men knew their score and watched it climb. That number is a psychological instrument of extraordinary power. It converts an indefinite ordeal into a finite one. A man who is told, "This will last until the war ends, and nobody knows when that is in a fundamentally different position from a man who can say, "I have this many points, and at this many I go home." The first man is staring into an abyss. The second man is on a road with an end. And there is a fourth thing the American researchers found. And it is the one that surprised the researchers themselves, because it did not match what anybody expected. They asked soldiers what kept them going, and they expected answers about the cause, about hatred of the enemy, about patriotism, about the flag. That is not what the men said. Overwhelmingly, what came back was, the men beside me. I could not let them down. I did not want them to think I had quit. Ideology barely registered. Abstract patriotism barely registered. What held a man in his hole under shell fire was, almost entirely, the small group. The 8 or 10 men he lived with, ate with, was terrified with. That was the load-bearing structure of combat motivation, and it was the same finding on both sides of the line, because it is a fact about human beings and not about nations. Now, this is precisely what the Germans believed too, and they were right about it. Comradeship was their answer, and their answer was correct. But look at what the Americans did with the same finding, because this is where the two armies part company. The Americans took the discovery that men fight for their small group and used it as an argument for keeping the group intact. Rotate the unit, not just the man. Rest the squad together. Give a recovering soldier his own company to come back to, not a strange one. Treat him near his outfit so the bond stays warm. The whole architecture of forward psychiatry, proximity, immediacy, expectancy, is really one idea. Do not separate the man from the people he is fighting for, because that bond is the medicine. The Germans had the same insight and were, by the end, structurally unable to act on it. Their formations were shattered and rebuilt with strangers, then shattered again. The squads that were the whole basis of a German soldier's will to fight were being dissolved and reconstituted so fast that the bonds never had time to form. Both armies knew that men fight for their friends. Only one of them still had the ability to keep a man's friends alive and beside him. The Germans had the abyss. The Americans had the road. Part 3. The River of Steel. Everything in Part 2 rests on one thing, and it is not compassion. It is arithmetic. You cannot rotate units out of the line unless you have units to put in. You cannot run rest centers unless you can spare the transport, the buildings, the food, the personnel. You cannot promise a man a countable end unless you have a replacement pipeline capable of actually delivering his relief. The American ability to be humane was built on the American ability to be enormous. The United States mobilized and trained an army of a size that gave it operational depth, the ability to hold a front and still have formations in reserve, resting, refitting, training. And behind that stood the whole apparatus we have documented across this series: the shipping, the food, the fuel, the medical chain, the training camps in the safe interior of a continent nobody was bombing. Rotation, rest centers, forward psychiatry, entertainment, a point system. Every single one of them is a downstream consequence of having more than you strictly need. Abundance did not merely let the Americans outproduce the Germans. It let them treat their soldiers differently, because it gave them the slack in the system to take a man out of the line without the line collapsing behind him. Germany had no slack, not one man of it. And so even the German commanders, who understood perfectly well that their men were being destroyed by exhaustion, could do nothing, because the alternative to leaving an exhausted division in the line was leaving a gap in the line. Now, honesty, because this channel does not do propaganda. The American system was not fair, and it was not fully solved, and the men it failed were failed badly. The great injustice of the American ground war was that the burden fell with grotesque unevenness on one group, the frontline infantry riflemen. They were a small fraction of the total force in Europe and took a wildly disproportionate share of the casualties. A rifleman in a line infantry division in Northwest Europe, in late 1944, was in one of the most dangerous jobs on earth, and the rotation and rest that the system provided, real as it was, did not come close to matching what he was being asked to absorb. And the individual replacement system, sending lone replacements forward to fill gaps in units they did not know, was a genuine and much criticized failure. A new man arrived alone, at night, into a company of strangers who had learned not to get attached to new arrivals, and he was, statistically, in appalling danger before he had made a single friend. That system stripped away the one protective factor everyone agreed mattered most, the bond with the men beside you, at exactly the moment the man needed it. It was known at the time. It was criticized at the time. It was never properly fixed. So the American answer was better. It was not good. It was a partial, imperfect, unevenly applied application of a correct insight, which is, in the end, what most human progress looks like. But look at the difference in direction, because that is what decided things. The Americans had identified the problem, named it correctly, studied it, built systems to address it, and were still arguing about how to do it better when the war ended. The Germans had a doctrine that denied the problem existed, a disciplinary system that punished its symptoms, and no manpower with which to have acted differently, even if they had wanted to. One army was failing to fully solve a problem it understood. The other was not permitted to admit the problem was real. Part 4. The German Realization. There were German officers who understood this. Of course there were. They were professionals watching their own men, and you cannot watch men come apart and not notice. German commanders reported units that were finished, not destroyed, finished. Formations that were still nominally at strength but were no longer capable of offensive action because the men in them had nothing left. The German language of unit assessment had categories for combat effectiveness, and by the last year of the war, a great many German formations were being reported at the bottom of those categories, not because they had been shot to pieces, but because they were used up. Good German officers did what good officers everywhere do. They protected their men where they could, got them out of the line when it was possible, rotated exhausted subunits within their own frontage, quietly shielded a man who was clearly at the end. But it was all improvised, local, and dependent on the character of the individual commander. There was no system. There was no institutional machinery that said, this is a known phenomenon. It happens on a measurable timescale. Here is the process for managing it. And there was, at the top, an ideological wall that made building such machinery close to impossible. A regime built on the idea of the racially superior, ideologically hardened warrior could not easily accept a scientific finding that said every man, regardless of ideology or race or willpower, has a fixed number of days in him before he comes apart. That finding was not merely inconvenient, it contradicted the premise. So the German soldier was left in the position that this channel keeps arriving at, from a different direction every time. He was asked to supply, out of his own body and mind, the thing his army could not deliver to him. Warmth, when there were no winter clothes. Calories, when there was no food. Fuel, when there was none. And now endurance, when there was no rest. And he did it. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a farce. He did it for an extraordinarily long time. But you cannot generate rest by wanting it. You cannot restock the mind with discipline. The clock the American researchers had measured was running for the German soldier exactly as it ran for the American one. Physiology does not check your nationality, and the difference was simply that when the American's number came up, there was, at least sometimes, a system that took him out and gave him a few days and told him he was normal. When the German's number came up, there was the line and the next attack, and the belief that a proper soldier does not run out. He did run out. They all do. The Americans had gone and measured exactly when. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in a line infantry division, or worked in the aid stations and rest centers, or was one of the medical officers who sat with exhausted men and told them, correctly, that what was happening to them was normal and that they would be all right, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. And if he came home and never talked about it, that is its own kind of record. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and among the many things the Allies take away from it, one of the most consequential is not a weapon or a territory or a treaty. It is a piece of knowledge about human beings. The finding that came out of that war, that combat breakdown is a function of exposure, that every normal man has a limit, that it is not cowardice and cannot be disciplined away, became the foundation of everything that followed in military psychiatry. The principles of forward treatment developed in that war are still doctrine, the recognition that psychological injury is injury, and not weakness, runs directly from those studies to the way modern armies and modern societies understand these things today. That knowledge was purchased at a price nobody would willingly pay, but the American Army went and got it, because when it encountered a problem it did not understand, its reflex was to go and measure it. So here is the verdict. The German army believed that a soldier's endurance was a matter of character, and that a properly formed man could be relied upon to keep going indefinitely. And it produced men of extraordinary toughness who kept going for an astonishingly long time, and the Allied officers who fought them never stopped being impressed by it. And it was still wrong. It was wrong in the way that a theory of physics can be wrong. Endurance is not a moral quality. It is a physiological resource, and it depletes. And when it is depleted, the man cannot continue, no matter what he believes, or how much he loves the men beside him, or how severe the punishment for failing. The American Army worked that out, imperfectly and late and never completely, and then did what it always did with a problem it understood. It built systems, forward treatment, rotation, rest, a number to count, none of it perfect, all of it in the right direction. And the result, across a long war, was an army whose men kept functioning, not because they were tougher, because they were not, and would have told you so, but because somebody was tracking the fuel gauge and, sometimes, pulling them off the road before the tank ran dry. The German army treated the human mind as a fortress that a good man simply holds. The American army treated it as a tank that empties, and built a system to fill it. And the mind, it turns out, is a tank. The German officer watching American units rotate out of the line thought he was watching an enemy too soft to stay. He was watching an enemy who had discovered something true about human beings that his own army was ideologically incapable of admitting, and who was, on the strength of that discovery, quietly keeping his soldiers in the fight for longer than the Germans could keep theirs. They were not leaving because they could not take it. They were leaving so that they could come back. The Germans could afford to demand endurance. The Americans could afford to resupply it. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the men who did not get enough of it. The riflemen, the small fraction of the army that took most of the dying, who were rotated when it could be managed and left in far too long when it could not, and who came home carrying things they mostly did not have words for and mostly did not say out loud, to a country that had not yet learned to ask. They were not trying to be tough. They were trying to last until it was over, and to bring the men beside them with them. Mostly, the ones who came back because somebody, somewhere in that enormous machine, had understood that a man is not infinite, and had built something, however imperfect, to give him back a little of what the line had taken. They deserve to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the plain, hard-won truth their war handed to everyone who came after, that there is no shame in reaching the end of what a person can carry, and that the failure, when it happens, belongs to the system that would not stop, and not to the man who could not go on.